Hi, my name is Peter Headley. I serve as the Director of Student Affairs and Services within Teaching and Learning and Student Experience. Thanks for having enough interest and curiosity to click on the link in the email and press play on the video. I'm going to be spending a few minutes talking about what the transition and orientation of students could look like in 2020 and the ways in which we might work together to create a necessarily different and virtual approach. Given the events of this year, it's obviously not going to be possible that we would do what we've always done, which is to say the usual big in-person launch in the bowl or orientation day at distributed locations, and for the majority of students, new and continuing, in-person activities and sessions just won't be a reality. The reality is that we'll need to find a way of sharing all the information and skills development in a largely virtual context, just as we'll be doing with the academic delivery and support services. There are lots of reasons to feel a little trepidatious about the prospect of doing things differently, but I encourage you to embrace that and recognize there are just as many reasons to feel positive about the fact that the current situation provides an opportunity to rethink our approach, our ways of doing things, with a focus on providing students with a new and positive experience on arrival and commencement. Our approach to date, while strong in many areas, has typically lacked an overall cross-campus multi-unit coordination of activities and content sharing. We haven't had a common language or understanding about the purpose of transition and orientation for incoming and even continuing students. This means we haven't always thought collectively about high and low level coordinated goals and outcomes, which means the majority of students have received a partial orientation rather than a fuller experience, which would provide the firm foundation we know is necessary. Working together will enable us to ensure students have the breadth of that crucial in-time information to take the actions we need them to take and to remove the gaps that may present barriers for some students, which may ultimately result in them not succeeding in their courses and programs. And thus far, leaders and colleagues from the following support units, along with the USSU and GSA, have committed to participating in and supporting this work. We equally recognise that there's an important role for academic units, which students typically think of as their homes in the university environment, not only when it comes to program information and registration, but also around social connection and building their network and community. We're aware that many academic units have already done some excellent work in the area of transition and orientation, and our invitation is to see if we can find ways of working together with some new ideas that I'm about to share. Given that we're already in the middle of June, there's a limited amount of time to develop and implement a new approach. 77 days until September the 1st, in fact, but who doesn't love another challenge in the middle of a global health crisis? All this means is that if we're to be successful, which we are, by the way, we will need to focus our attention and have a narrower scope than we might have had if we had more time in our hands. So as such, the main focus of this work will be on new students joining direct entry colleges. Having said that, the content we'll be creating and sharing will be applicable to all learners, both new and continuing, in all colleges. We also need to think carefully about providing meaningful, tailored content for other student audiences as listed here to the right. So, how are we going to organise this work? After researching some best practices and following discussions with multiple campus stakeholders, we've developed a framework with 6 elements. They are life and living skills and supports, health, wellness and harm prevention, social connection and community building, academic skills, strategies and learning supports, career support and financial planning, and program and course information. This type of multi-dimensional approach is designed to provide that foundation which students need and from which they can build. If this process is left in silos, as can often occur in large university environments, content is often delivered in parallel, which misses out on the opportunity to connect content that has obvious synergies and value for the learner in being connected. It also means that students will tend to self-select the things which seem more relevant to them and ignore the rest, which can result in them missing out on critically important content. As an example of that, in 2020 could be new students developing the knowledge and skills to succeed in an online learning environment and understanding how to access remotely delivered support services. Students will often go straight to the part of the plate where the steak is sitting, which is to say the program and course information, but overlook and ignore the broccoli and potatoes, which is, for example, the information about health, life skills, and career supports. We're hoping that a renewed approach will allow us to make visible those elements and stress the importance to students of eating their vegetables as well as the steak for a balanced experience, as it were. Apologies to any vegetarians out there for the analogy. The goal is to remove the swim lanes that we've typically seen remain in place in order to create a fully coordinated transition and orientation experience. And following several weeks of development, this is what I'll call Framework 2.0. This is what it looks like. Now notice that all 6 elements are there, but that the social connection and community building elements are now wrapped around it all, holding all the other elements together. This was through a general recognition that they remain the crucial piece of transition, perhaps the hardest piece to do well in the current virtual context. It now exists as a whole rather than a collection of individual elements. And notice that the students and their experience is very intentionally at the center of that work and the focus of it. We're thinking not about a single orientation day or welcome week, as we typically have done in the past, but rather about a series of activities and offerings across multiple elements and areas that will be delivered over the course of 5 or 6 months, and then rolled forward again for the incoming students in January of 2021. The focus of that timing is on that in-time information which will enable students to be informed and take the action we know will help them move forward. The entire process is designed to familiarise students with the new virtual USASK and the resources available to them. We plan to achieve this via a new landing page on the main website, which will be a hub with key areas as mocked up here, which would lead to links to other resources, information and activities. So, how are we going to go about creating those resources, information and activities? In truth, many of them exist already and can be used as they are. So, for example, static website information. However, other elements and activities, such as in-person presentations that we've done in the past, will need some thought to function effectively in a virtual context. For the past 20 years, I've been involved with orientations and looked out across students' faces in those sessions and workshops, and every time without fail, I always see a large percentage of faces looking bored, and increasingly nowadays, there's just as many faces looking down into devices of one kind or another. Which is to say that we probably shouldn't kid ourselves that we've been doing an amazing job at welcoming and orienting students. The irony, of course, is that while the new virtual context seems challenging, we will at least be appearing on the screens that our bored students were already looking at, which gives us a greater opportunity to get their attention by doing and trying something different. And if we don't get it quite right the first time out, students will likely be no more disengaged online than they would have been if they'd been with us in person. But the goal is to engage them. To do so, we need to think about content and activities which have a visible purpose or outcome which has value in their eyes. We need to identify the appropriate mode of delivery so that students don't just click through the content or worse still, not access it at all. We need to ask ourselves what we want the students to be able to do with the content we share, and if we can't figure out the answer to this, that tells us that the content is not essential for this purpose. The content should be 4 things: concise, engaging, timely, and actionable in some ideally short-term way. And if we can achieve this, we'll be providing an interesting and meaningful experience that will help provide the solid foundation for personal and academic success that we've been aiming for all along. And as I said, if it's not perfect first time out, there's still a good chance it'll be superior to what we were doing last year. There are multiple modes of delivery that we can look at for content, and each has their own individual strengths in terms of effectiveness, but they also have weaknesses. For example, podcasts are a powerful one-way communication mechanism for engaging listeners, sharing information, and creating connection around certain topics. They can also be downloaded and taken with people in their daily lives, on a walk or a run, in the car, which is a major plus. On the downside, they're less effective for genuinely changing perspectives or behavior in a longer term. The interaction engagement of an online learning module, for example, in either Blackboard or Canvas, or a live web session is much stronger for this kind of purpose. And the choice of format for each piece of learning should be determined by the answer to the question, what do we want participants to do with the content? And the content offering or activity doesn't need to be epic in scale. A staff, faculty, or even student staff member learning the skills, if they don't have them already, to create a 3-minute explainer video or a 10-minute podcast in their basement, which is what I'm doing right now, with free software, can be just as valuable as a more formally team-created piece of media or formal learning content. We need to be bold enough to innovate and try new things with the knowledge that not everything will work as well as we hope, but it will be something rather than nothing, and in this situation, speed trumps perfection. The process of content creation should begin with a consideration of high-level goals in key areas. For example, to facilitate initial academic advisement, course selection, and registration. The goal then translates into the outcome, skill, or practice that we want to see students exhibit or demonstrate, which in this case is students being able to select courses and register during the appropriate time frame. Students accordingly has that in-time knowledge and direction they need to take the action to move themselves forward to start their courses. And so we then need to challenge ourselves to consider the best mode of delivery for this information. In this case, it's likely to be fairly conventional, an email, an auto message reminder triggered by the university system. But we could consider adding a short explainer video for those who may find this process more challenging to understand and execute. Thinking about the process with these 3 steps makes it fairly straightforward to go from high-level goals to outcomes, which then guide us to understanding and creating the activity or offering. And as the planning team began to think about how to create an approach and content that would be likely to be successful for our students, we looked at platforms such as LinkedIn Learning, which has notably reached 17 million users in just 4 years, and we looked at why they had the success they did. We felt there were 3 key pieces that should inform our thinking as outlined in blue here. So number 1, the system is designed towards personalization. Number 2, the content is both designed in bite-sized chunks and accessible at any time on multiple devices. And number 3, the learner also gains a certificate for completing pieces of learning. So that's personalization, concise and accessible, and provides recognition of time spent and learning. And with those thoughts in mind, let's go back to our own content planning. Here's some planned content offerings and activities from the area of academic skills, strategies, and learning supports that colleagues from Student Learning Services are working on, supported by the Distance Education Unit. As we know, there are so many important areas and topics around academic skills, time management, study strategies, communication skills, and so on. I used to teach these topics myself, and I would describe these to my students as the vegetables on the plate that I was talking about before. Now, as I said, ideally we'd like students to eat them all, but we know that's not realistic when they want to eat the steak and then ideally move on to dessert. But how do we get students to engage with at least some of this content? And if they do engage, how do they go about choosing from what for many of them will seem an overwhelming number of options when perhaps they have limited time? We're thinking about creating an individualized self-assessment tool, which would pose questions around key knowledge and skills that they have, or they feel they don't, associated with success in the post-secondary environment. Students would be invited to complete this as a pre-registration task and rate themselves in these key areas. Now, based upon how they rate themselves, the system would identify their greatest areas of need and provide them with a personalized set of transition and orientation activities and offerings. While we might think that students overrate their own skills, which would rather invalidate this exercise, the opposite is often true, especially when they know that what they share will be confidential, which it will be in this case. The theory, at least, is that being provided with a list of the most relevant offerings will increase the chance of their engagement with them. Their personalized list could have active web links so that the students could engage with them straight away. We could also explore the possibility of the student being able to export their personalized list into a PDF and print it off for later use. As you can probably tell, this remains a work in progress, and we'll keep you updated. So, back to that overwhelming list. The outcomes of the self-assessment exercise has now trimmed it down significantly to something which hopefully now feels way more realistic and relevant for students to tackle. So now the student has their personalized activity list, they still need to take the time and do the work, but keep in mind, all these activities are accessible at any time, again on multiple devices. But how do we further incentivize the completion of the tasks and activities? So for each completed task, the student will receive a code number. More about that in just a moment. Some activities, especially the more in-depth ones, such as formal online learning modules, could offer a co-curricular record credit, which is to say, by the time students complete their transition orientation, they've already received recognition of time spent and learning. The co-curricular record is a potentially valuable tool in motivating some learners to engage with some of the content, but again, that's a work in progress that may or may not be achievable this year. We'll keep you posted. Given obvious time constraints, we need to think about how we can repurpose suitable existing materials to form part of our offerings. As an example from my experience, I typically offer a How to Thrive at University presentation as the Lunch and Learn session as part of USTART. The audience of several hundred incoming students and their families are crammed into the big lecture theatre over in the Health Sciences building. And it's a great format, but for obvious reasons it was going to be impossible this year. So I adjusted the content by creating a script for a guided conversation, which I recorded as a podcast with myself and Nancy Turner, discussing the same topics and ideas. The content worked well in its original format, but I feel the change of the mode of delivery and the addition of another voice and perspective really elevated it. So big shout out to Dr. Nancy Turner for that. As mentioned at the beginning, given the virtual context, we need to challenge ourselves to think about how we can use this content and programming to help foster social connection and sense of community. Social media, as the name suggests, can be a particularly suitable vehicle for this purpose. So student leaders and other student groups are particularly tuned in to what students need, what platforms they're on, and what attracts their interest. A great example of this was the energy and skill that our fantastic communications team and designers put into these Convocation 2020 designs, templates, printed materials, and hashtags, which were provided to students to personalize them and share them on their own channels, which our graduates did in their hundreds, as these examples show. We're planning to create something similar for the fall 2020 commencement that will generate a sense of fun, excitement, anticipation, and pride. What we know from the experience of Convocation is if we provide students the platform, framework, and tools to create something, they do so by using their own creativity and networks to share something which multiplies and grows in a way and with a reach which is beyond what we could have imagined or achieved on our own. Which is to say, we don't have to do all the heavy lifting. If we can put up the basic framework, students will build the rest of the house on their own. And this theory is backed up by lots of practice we've seen. In case you thought I'd forgotten about those codes for completing activities, here they are again. Students will enter those codes online to enter prize draws and giveaways. The more codes of a certain kind you have, the more chance you have of winning different prizes over the course of several weeks. So it's not just a one-off. These don't always need to be high-value items in terms of the prizes to ensure participation. Prizes like USASK, merchandise, and clothing can also help build a strong sense of shared identity, community, and pride. And again, when the shirt arrives, they take a picture of it, share that picture. So it just is a cycle that works very well in that way. Another way of generating a sense of excitement and anticipation, rather than the trepidation that some students might be feeling right now about the commencement of the new academic year, could be by featuring a countdown clock on the main website, counting down to that welcome day. And we'll need to give some collective thought to what the welcome day will look like and how we can create that sense of excitement and engagement in a largely virtual context. We'll be watching closely at how other organizations during the summer months handle similar kinds of large events, looking at the struggles they encounter as well as the successes they achieve. And I suggest everyone else does the same for ideas. So let's start winding up. In terms of next steps, we're in the process of creating several working groups which will be divided up into the key areas that I shared at the start. The small core planning committee will oversee all areas to ensure that the crossovers and synergies that underpins this approach exist and are being identified and leveraged. The working groups will have different objectives with the goal of bringing all of these pieces together ahead of the August-September commencement. 77 days, like I said. Finally, Gillian May, the TLSE event coordinator, will be reaching out to you and your teams this week, so please keep an eye out for that communication. In the meantime, please give some thought to how your already planned activities might fit in with this approach and who in your team can support this work. If you want to reach out to Gillian in the meantime, of course you can at this address. If you try saying it out loud, you'll find that it rhymes. Thanks again for your interest and taking the time to watch to the end. And if you didn't watch to the end, then I guess you're not even listening. I wonder if anyone's listening.